My name is Mariel Klein, and I'm the president of the Crimson, and I have the pleasure of introducing Jackie Calms tonight. So Jackie joined the New York Times as a national correspondent in its Washington bureau in August 2008. She covered politics and economic policy through the Great Recession and its aftermath. She covered the White House for the first 5 years of the Obama administration. And before joining the Times, she worked 18 years at the Wall Street Journal and the Washington bureau, covering Congress in the Clinton and Bush administrations and focusing on budget and tax legislation. And she ended there as the chief political correspondent for the 2006 and 2008 campaign cycles. After she reported on the 2000 Bush campaign and election recount, she covered election reform and politics in the state capitals as well as Washington. And in June 2001, she became editor of the journal's Politics and Policy page and reporter-writer of the venerable front-page Washington Wire column. For her coverage of the Bush White House and re-election campaign in 2004, she was awarded the Gerald Ford Journalism Prize for reporting on the presidency. And Ms. Calms began her journalism career covering state politics, government, and assorted goings-on in Texas at the Abilene, Texas. Did I say that correctly? Yes. Abilene. Okay, there we go. Reporter News, and then went on to Austin for the Capitol Bureau of the Hart Hanks newspapers, and then the Austin Bureau of the Dallas Morning News. She moved to Washington, D.C. in 1984, and she worked for the Congressional Quarterly until 1990, and for a year as a congressional reporter for the Atlanta Constitution and Cox newspaper, and was hired by the Wall Street Journal in 1990. A native of Ohio, Ms. Calms earned a bachelor's degree in journalism from the University of Toledo and a master's degree in journalism from Northwestern. She has two daughters, Sarah and Carrie. That is great. And I got to chat with her briefly for tonight. I'm really excited to welcome Jackie up here.
Thank you. Are there any Texans in the room?
Yeah.
Have you ever been to Abilene? 9 of the longest months of my life. All right. Chris never knew me in these, but I'm going to have to put these on because it's that time of my life. It's really an honor to be here, and not least to reconnect with the Georges family and to keep alive the memory of their son and brother and my friend and colleague, Chris Georges. Chris and I had worked in the Wall Street Journal's Washington bureau in the 1990s, mostly covering Congress together, and what was then what we thought were wild times. Newt Gingrich and his so-called Republican revolutionaries had just taken over the House of Representatives, and it was the first time that the Republican Party had done so in 40 years, which at that point was my entire life. But compared to today's Republican politics, Gingrich and his so-called revolutionaries were nothing but raging moderates. And at the time, they kept us busy with conservative ideas, budget fights with Bill Clinton, shutdowns of the government, sound familiar, before they were humbled by party infighting and the general unpopularity, frankly, of a lot of their ideas. What I didn't realize, though, as Chris sat beside me in our cramped little space in the Senate Press Gallery, and as he'd occasionally go off outside the Washington Beltway to see how some of these changes, like in welfare programs, were affecting real people in their lives. Single mothers, individuals who were struggling with the end of the welfare entitlement to find jobs without the jobs and without the job skills to really make it on their own, and to break out of a cycle of dependency. What I didn't know when Chris was doing all this was that he was suffering from the effects of the disease that would, in 1998, take him from us way too soon. Chris had so much still to give, not least to journalism, which is why it's appropriate, almost 2 decades later, that new generations of potential journalists like yourself should spend a whole weekend, if not longer, thinking deeply about journalism and the profession in his name at this forum. I was attracted to journalism at an age younger than all of you. My family didn't have much money, but my father made sure that both of Toledo, Ohio's newspapers were delivered to our house. I'd get on the floor and I'd put out the morning paper, especially on the weekends, and then when I came home from school, I'd put out the evening paper. He died when I was 11, so I have too few memories of him, but among them was his love of news and public affairs and his willingness, which didn't seem odd at the time, but now I know it is, to talk to me about all of it. I wanted to meet people who made news and go to the places where they made it, like Washington. And not to dwell on sad times, but the remainder of my marks, I'm going to reference another person I've known who left us way too soon, Robin Toner, a New York Times reporter who was my friendly competitor when I was at the Wall Street Journal, and for the last months of her life, my colleague at the New York Times after 2008. She died in December of 2008. There's now an annual journalism award and dinner in her honor, honoring political journalism, and it was just weeks ago that the latest occurred. The keynote speaker was President Obama, and I'm going to weave his remarks into my own here. Fittingly, I should say, the winner of the Toner Prize this year was a man I don't know very well, Alec McGillis of ProPublica, but I respect him immensely. He won, I think this is so appropriate, he won not for campaign coverage of this wacky and worrisome presidential election race, but for his deeply reported stories beyond Washington and the campaign trail of the impact of politics, policy, and dark money, unreported money, undisclosed donors, on the policies that shape people's lives, affect people's lives. At the Toner dinner, Obama described Robin Toner this way, and you could substitute Chris George's name just as well. Quote, "She always saw herself as being a servant for the American public. She had a sense of mission and purpose in her work. For Robin, politics was not a horse race or a circus or a tally of who scored more political points than whom, but rather was fundamentally about issues and how they affected the lives of real people. While it's only been 7 years since Robin died, she would be surprised by the pace of change in our profession. The paper and its vaunted front page are now secondary to the website, the homepage, and increasingly our mobile formats. For 18 years that I worked at a paper, the Wall Street Journal, it didn't even run photographs. Now the Wall Street Journal and the Times are encouraging reporters to do videos. I was going to read you an email we got today from our leaders, Dean Beckay and Mark Thompson, about the latest innovation they want us to be part of in video. But unfortunately, the print would be too small, so I'm not even going to bore you with it, and I'm just going to keep on where I got this in 16-point type. But it's just changing literally by the day. When I think back to when Robin and I started in journalism nearly 40 years ago, it almost seems like it was a different profession. Now technology has changed it into a 24/7 operation that has tested our ability to get and accurately report the facts and the audience's attention span. Even as the old business model for journalism of advertising, want ads, and paid subscriptions was all but dying, and newspapers with it. But important traits remain universal, and that's what I want to impress on all of you. You've heard it before. It can't be repeated enough. The imperative to be accurate and fair. If you're going to publish or air something about someone, think about whether you'd want to know or respond if that were about you. Someone receiving critical coverage should not be surprised when they see their name in print or on air. If you've contacted them in advance, they should not be, which you presumably have, they also should not be surprised by the approach you take and the conclusion you've drawn. Sometimes it's difficult. I remember the first time I had to contact the Speaker of the Texas House in Austin about an allegation. It was a great story. take my word for it. I was so nervous that at 11 o'clock in the morning I did a shot of scotch. Much is made about bias in news reporting, and it's long been true that, well, since I started my career, people have talked about liberal bias in journalism, and it's how it should be, because journalists should be held to a higher standard. We actually do have a lot of power. A higher standard for fairness and balance. Even those with a license to be a columnist or opinion writer should, in their own way. And I think I'd be interested in what Anne Marie thinks. I think there's little question that the bent in journalism, when I began, was liberal, and it was a tilt, I think, reflecting the times. They were times shaped by the movements for civil rights, anti-war fervor, feminism, environmentalism, and by a scandal that saw the first president in our history resign from office in disgrace. I don't think that the liberal tilt is as pronounced these days, for all you hear about it from the right. In fact, I've concluded over time that the tilt in journalism, and we're talking about the dread mainstream media here because that's all I know, is more that if you're drawn to journalism, and in particular politics and government journalism, typically you think government should work. And if your bias is toward thinking government should work, in these days, I think, it may appear to others that your Democrats are the party of government. They like government to work. So if it seems like you're favoring Democrats, it's because there's such a pronounced anti-government tilt on the Republican Party, to the chagrin of many of my old Republican friends. So I think I think of it less as an ideological tilt, as one about how you, if you're covering politics and government, how you see the role of government, whether you think there is much of a role of government. From the start, I almost never found it hard to be even-handed in covering politics or government, regardless of my personal opinion on something. Friends in both parties over the years have asked me, how can you not take sides? And it's so easy for me to answer because it's why I got into journalism. Like Obama said of Robin Toner, it's a mission. I mean, I don't want to sound too highfalutin, but it's sort of what it is. I wanted to watch and experience firsthand the making of history and explain it to people. And that required understanding all sides and fairly representing all sides, even when I disagreed with one or the other. But now for political reporting, I think recent years' developments in the Republican Party have shown that even-handedness must not become so absolute that journalists practice what's come to be called false equivalence. At the risk of simplifying, that is typically the practice that if you're reporting that Democrats did something or Republicans, you insert soon after that the other side is just as bad. They usually do the same things. But consider what political scientists Thomas Mann and Norm Ornstein first wrote a few years ago. During the Bush administration, when Republicans controlled both the White House and Congress, they wrote a book called The Broken Branch about how the legislative branch, Congress, was not functioning as it should. Within a few years, they were moved to write a follow-up book. They called it It's As Bad as It Looks. And this time they said, the problems are more the fault of the Republicans. And I agree. And you know what? So do a lot of my Republican friends, including Republicans who have served in Congress or in previous presidential administrations. And it's not good for democracy when you don't have two healthy parties, and I think this presidential race is showing the natural outgrowth of what's happening in the Republican Party as it has been tearing itself apart. And this has real implications for journalism and how you cover it, how you cover politics and government. It was a 20-year House Republican veteran from Iowa whose quote gave me the title of the research paper I did last year at the Shorenstein Center here at the Kennedy School. My paper was about the corrosive impact of an expanded conservative media and its allies among conservative groups on the Republican Party. The title was, and when I would do like radio shows or something, they'd read the title. The title was, They Don't Give a Damn About Governing. And I would quickly interject, that's not my words. That's this Republican words. And he was, by the way, one of the members of the Gingrich Revolutionaries in 1994 and 95. But now he's like a raging establishment member that is so disparaged in their party. Obama addressed this matter of false equivalence in his Toner address. He said, quote, "While fairness is the hallmark of good journalism, false equivalency all too often these days can be a fatal flaw. If I say the world is round and someone else says it's flat, that's worth reporting. But you might also want to report on a bunch of scientific evidence that seems to support the notion that the world is round. And that shouldn't be buried in paragraph 5 or 6, unquote. It's no accident that Republicans are in a virtual civil war. Their conservative base has been nurtured for years on the often nasty, even vulgar fare of talk radio, talk that does not report facts, even dismisses them, especially if they're reported by the New York Times. But it serves up opinion and an overt bias that validates that of the audience, much of it white male. If you're surprised that more than half of Republicans believe Obama is Muslim, spend some time on conservative radio. Obama said, quote, "I'm not the only one who may be more than a little dismayed about what's happening on the campaign trail right now." And he added, quote, "It's worth asking ourselves what each of us, as politicians or journalists, but most of all as citizens, may have done to contribute to this atmosphere in our politics," unquote. And he took some blame himself, although not very specific, so it's unclear to me where he thinks he went wrong. But, politics has been rough from the beginning, since the founders. I mean, Aaron Burr killed Alexander Hamilton, for God's sake. But Obama said, and I agree, quote, "What we're seeing right now does corrode our democracy and our society," unquote. "Our democracy depends on a well-informed electorate," he said. He self-servingly boasted that he has been true to his campaign promises. I can quibble with that, but on balance, as a politician, he has. And he said the reason that he thinks his promises and policies jibe is that in 2007 and 8, when he first ran, that political reporters like myself and Robin asked tough questions about whether his proposals added up. And that's true. I mean, I spent a lot of hours at the Wall Street Journal and a lot of ink on candidates' tax plans, budget plans, foreign policies. And Obama asked, the question is, in the current media environment, is it still true? Is it still true that reporters are really holding candidates to account for what they've proposed? I think he has a point, and based on past experience, but it doesn't really seem to matter anymore. It seems like this has been, well, I think it's without question, this has been the least substantive presidential campaign in my experience, especially on the Republican side. But the press, including the New York Times, has done fewer stories on substance and more than ever on process and horse race. And I'm not one of these people who doesn't think there's a place for process and horse race stories. I think there are, and I think a lot of readers want to read them. But even if readers aren't like begging for substance and policy, we have to provide it. It's the public service aspect of journalism. In the past month, I did stories on Republicans' multi-trillion-dollar tax cut plans and Bernie Sanders' agenda, all of which are wildly unrealistic and would pile trillions of dollars on the debt. I got hate mail from both sides, social media, email. Conservatives dismiss my piece as the work of the hated mainstream media, while Sanders supporters on the left wrote off my story as the work of the corporate media. And if I could just say something about corporate media, a good word. First of all, only a corporation like the New York Times Company can afford to have global bureaus, including more than a decade in Kabul and Baghdad and places like that, where it's required that we have multi-million-dollar investments for simply to have security for the reporters who are working there. Obama admonished reporters to do more to ferret out truth, even when it takes aim at him, because he says that's what Americans want, and I agree. Yet I think he underestimates that these days in our polarized society, many people, especially on the right, but on the left as well, have come to define their own truth, informed by their own biases, and they can go in the age of the internet to seek media outlets that will give them that, a validation of their biases, whether it's Breitbart.com or The Nation. And that's okay. I have no problem with that, as long as you're also in your news diet consuming news that tests what you believe, that gives you facts other than what you think is true. I have to tell you that I do believe there's a vast public hungry for facts, for fair analysis and context. Even if they don't like a story I do, as long as they're civil, I write back to everyone and engage them, and I thank them for their perspective. Because it does help. There are people, I have sources today who originally wrote me angry emails. I remain proud to be a journalist, and I have never spent a minute regretting that this is the path I took. To the contrary. But in closing, I have to say, it's an honor to be here, but I only wish it were possible to turn the tables. I would rather be in the audience for you, because given everything I've just described and the changes in the business, I'm just really interested in what each of you are attracted to journalism for. I know that not all of you are, but those of you who take that path, I'm just so intrigued by what you find interesting about journalism today. I hope you have questions for me, or I'll be really embarrassed up here. But I would be just as pleased to hear from you what attracts you to journalism. Thanks for your attention, and congratulations on the early achievements that have brought you all here today already. It speaks so highly of all of you. I'm impressed. Thanks.